When working with Spring Boot's auto configuration, we can use system parameters to override the default auto configuration settings. This approach is a little bit less than ideal. One of the issues you'll encounter is that those system parameters have to find their way into a startup script that would run every time the application starts. This creates a maintenance problem. Now, there are several other ways we can specify our configuration when using auto configuration. Spring Boot allows us to use environment variables, JNDI, and several other ways. In this lesson, we'll discuss one of the most common ways to override the auto configuration settings, and that's the application.properties file. The application.properties file is an externalized file that we can place on our class path to specify custom configurations to Spring Boot. This allows us to better organize the configuration for our project, and it will be in a more readable form. So to get started, let's create our application.properties file. Within the Package Explorer, navigate to the Source Main Resources directory, and within that directory, open up the New dialog by hitting Control and then pressing N. Within this dialog, we would like to open the File Wizard, so select File and then hit Next, and then simply type application.properties, and then click on Finish, and this will create the application.properties file within our project. And you'll notice that it gets that nice icon with the leaf, and that's because STS knows this file is important to Spring. So it gives it a little special icon there. And that should clue you in that STS is going to provide us with some additional features for this file and how we work with it. So if you go ahead and hit Control and then Space, you'll notice that STS is providing us with IntelliSense to work with this file, and it's going to allow us to peruse all of the available properties that we can use to configure our Spring project. So for example, if we look at the server options, there we can specify the port. So you'll remember we were running our server on port 9000, and if we further look at our configuration options, you'll see the context path can be specified. All the different options that we have with Spring Boot for configuring our project can be found within this IntelliSense, and that's a great tooling feature of STS and really is a good driver for working with this IDE when building Spring projects. So we'll go ahead and set our context path to /test, and then we'll save our application.properties file. Now, you'll remember that within our run configurations for our Spring Boot application, we had specified these as program arguments. So we can go ahead and remove those program arguments because those system arguments are no longer required since we are using the application.properties file to specify our project's custom configuration for Spring Boot. So let's quickly demonstrate that our application.properties file does indeed impact our configuration. I will relaunch the Spring Boot application, and if I navigate to my browser, I can then go to localhost port 9000, hit the test directory, and I receive the response from our application. Let's return back to STS, and we're going to navigate over to our application.java file, and we'll put some changes into this file that will further demonstrate the power of the application.properties approach. So within this class, I'm going to add a new string, and I'm going to give it the name of name. And then I'm going to annotate this variable with the value annotation, and we'll import that annotation, and then we will specify some expression language to get the value that will be dependency injected into this string. So there you can see we're going to dependency inject the name property, and then we'll go ahead within our controller method and we'll return that name. So if we now head to our application.properties file, we can add our own name property, and we can just say Spring Boot, and that property within the application.properties file will become a property available to us for dependency injection within our Spring application. So once again, let's relaunch our Spring Boot application, and we'll navigate over to our browser, and we'll hit that URL once again. And this time you'll notice that the value returned by our REST controller is now Spring Boot, and that value was found within our application.properties file. So those values are available to the application. Returning back to STS, we'll run one more demonstration that shows how we can use placeholders within the application.properties file. So within the application.properties file, when we specify a property, let's say we specify a type property and we'll just give it a value of framework, we can then reference that property later within the application.properties file. So all we need to do is go ahead and put a placeholder within our properties file using the expression language syntax, and you'll see now that if we relaunch our Spring Boot application, that we will have in fact used the value to fill that placeholder. So navigating back to our browser and running, you now see that we were able to use a placeholder within our properties to change that value that we display. So there's a lot of power within this application.properties file, and you can see that as your configuration gets more customized and more specific to your project, this is a very great place to put them instead of as a program argument where it's going to be a little bit less readable, a little less easier to maintain, especially when you consider the IntelliSense that you are receiving from the STS IDE within the application.properties file. So in this lesson, we took a look at another way that we can specify customized configuration for our Spring Boot project, and that allows us to overwrite some of the defaults provided by auto configuration.